Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. Instead of a single king making bad decisions because his family tree is a wreath, we're going to look at the people who had to clean up the mess. So, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket and get comfortable. We're drifting back to Victorian London, specifically 1888. A year everyone knows because of a certain guy in Whitechapel who was very bad at conflict resolution. But we aren't really focusing on him tonight. We're going inside the houses that were trying very hard to ignore him. We are going below stairs. Let's just settle into the atmosphere for a second. It's London. It's late. The fog is that thick, yellow pea souper variety that tastes like coal and regret. You can't see your hand in front of your face, which is probably for the best, because your hand is likely covered in soot anyway. The gas lamps are flickering, casting those long, wobbly shadows that look like ghosts, but are probably just a stray cat or a very tired policeman. It's quiet. Mostly, the hansom cabs have stopped clattering over the cobblestones for the night, but inside the big townhouses in Mayfair or Kensington, the day isn't over. It never really is. If you were one of the thousands of people working in service in 1888, your life was defined by one very specific geometric concept: verticality. You lived your life on a staircase, and not the nice part of the staircase with the plush carpet and the mahogany banister. No, you lived on the back stairs, the steeper, uncarpeted, treacherous stairs that smelled like cabbage and damp wall. The structure of the house was a physical manifestation of the social hierarchy, because the Victorians loved nothing more than a metaphor you could literally trip over. At the very top, in the freezing cold attic, were the female servants. At the very bottom, in the basement, were the male servants, and in between lay the neutral zone of the kitchen and the scullery, where everyone met to complain about the people living on the first floor. Let's start at the absolute bottom of the food chain, shall we? The scullery maid. If the Victorian household was a machine, the scullery maid was the grease. But, you know, the grease that nobody wants to acknowledge exists. She was usually young, maybe 13 or 14, and her entire existence revolved around hot water, soda crystals, and scrubbing brushes. She was the girl. That was her name. It didn't matter if her name was Mary, or Elizabeth, or Gertrude, which were, statistically speaking, the only 3 names available in England at the time. She was just the girl. She woke up before everyone else, usually around 5:30 in the morning. Why? Because the fires needed to be lit. And fires, as we know, are needy, high-maintenance toddlers that demand attention before the sun is even up. She'd creep down the stairs in the pitch black, because using a candle was considered a waste of the master's money, and God forbid we waste a halfpenny of wax. She had to clear out the grate from the night before, black-lead the iron until it shone like a mirror, and lay the new fire. And she had to do this in every room on the ground floor before the real servants, the housemaids, and the cook came down. The scullery maid's hands were essentially ruined by the age of 15. Constant immersion in hot water and harsh soda meant they were red, cracked, and raw. But nobody looked at her hands. Nobody looked at her. She was expected to be invisible. If the master or mistress of the house walked into the kitchen, which they rarely did, because why would they go to the place where the food comes from? The scullery maid was expected to face the wall. Literally. She had to turn her back and pretend to be a piece of furniture, presumably a very damp. It's a strange psychological game, isn't it? To have someone living in your house, scrubbing your forks, washing your underwear, and yet you pretend they are a phantom. Then we have the cook. Now, the cook was the dictator of the basement. If the scullery maid was the peasant, the cook was the petty warlord. In 1888, the kitchen was hot, unbearably hot. You have this massive coal range burning all day, turning the basement into a sauna that smelled like roasting mutton and suet pudding. The cook was usually a woman of certain years, which is polite Victorian for she's seen things and she's tired. She was often red-faced, partly from the heat and partly, perhaps, from the cooking sherry that had a mysterious habit of evaporating. And who could blame her? She had to prepare 5-course meals that looked like architectural marvels. The Victorians didn't just want food, they want edifices. A pie couldn't just be a pie. It had to look like a Roman Colosseum made of pastry. A Jilly had to tremble with just the right amount of anxiety. And everything was heavy. Iron pots, copper pans, ceramic bowls. There was no aluminum, no non-stick. Just heavy, conductive metal that burned you if you looked at it wrong. The cook shouted orders. The kitchen maid scrambled, and the scullery maid cried quietly over a sink full of greasy roasting pans. It was a symphony of chaos. Also, the family upstairs could sit in silence and eat a piece of boiled fish. Let's float over to the male side of things for a moment. The footman. The footman. He was the peacock of the servant world. While the maids were hired for their ability to scrub, the footman was hired for his calves. I'm not joking. A good, shapely calf muscle was a genuine employment requirement. You see, the footman was a status symbol. He was there to open doors, carry letters on silver trays, and stand around looking decorative. He was living drapes. If you were a wealthy family in 1888, you wanted your footman to match. Same height, same build. Like a set of collectible action figures, if one of them was an inch too short, well, he'd have to go. Or maybe wear lifts in his shoes, because symmetry is more important than human dignity. Their uniforms were ridiculous. Plush breeches, silk stockings, and powdered hair. Yes, in 1888, they were still powdering their hair for formal occasions. It was a messy, sticky process involving flour and grease. Imagine having to rub lard into your hair and then dust it with flour before you could serve soup. You'd smell like a rancid biscuit by the end of the night. But despite looking like a festive ornament, the footman had a miserable job. He was on display constantly. He couldn't sit down while on duty. He had to stand in the hall, staring at the wall, waiting for a bell to ring. And the bells, the bells. The house was wired with a system of bells, each with a different tone. The drawing-room bell, the master's bedroom bell, the front door bell. The servants had to learn the pitch of each one perfectly. It was like living inside a badly tuned piano. When the bell rang, the footman had to glide up the stairs to answer it. "Did you ring, sir?" "Yes, James. Move this book 3 inches to the left." "Very good, sir." And back down the stairs he went. It was cardio fueled by sheer existential boredom. And let's not forget the butler, the CEO of the basement. The butler was usually a man who had completely sublimated his own personality into the service of the house. He was grave, silent, and knew where the good wine was kept. He was the only one allowed to lock up the silver at night. In fact, many butlers slept with the silver chest in their room, sometimes even across the doorway, guarding the forks with their lives. Because, obviously, a spoon is worth dying for. The butler had a special relationship with the master. He was the only servant the master would really speak to. They would discuss the wine cellar, or the state of the cigars, or perhaps the weather. But it was always a conversation between a man and his shadow. The butler knew everything. He knew about the debts, the mistresses, the nervous exhaustion of the mistress, the wayward son's gambling habits. Ick knew it all, and his job was to pretend he knew absolutely nothing. He was a vault in a waistcoat. Meanwhile, outside, London was changing. 1888 was a weird year. You had the construction of Tower Bridge going on, this massive, industrial Gothic beast rising out of the Thames. It was a marvel of engineering. Huge steel caissons being sunk into the riverbed. It represented progress, the future, the might of the empire. And yet, inside these houses, life was stuck in a feudal time loop. You had people scrubbing floors on their knees with blocks of sandstone, just like they did in the Middle Ages. While outside, steam engines were hauling tons of steel into the sky. The contrast is what gets me. The Victorians were obsessed with cleanliness. Obsessed. They believed that dirt was moral failing. If you were dirty, you were a bad person. So the house had to be spotless. But London was filthy. The air was full of soot. If you left a window open for an hour, a layer of black dust would settle on everything. So the maids were fighting a losing war against the very atmosphere of the city. They dusted, and the city dusted back. It was a cycle of futility. You sweep the stairs, the soot falls. You sweep the stairs again. It's the myth of Sisyphus, but with a dustpan and brush and a mob cap. And where did these people sleep? Let's go up to the attic. The female servants' quarters. It was freezing in the winter because heat rises, but apparently not enough to reach the fourth floor. It was boiling in the summer because the slate roof acted like a pizza oven. The rooms were small, shared, and sparsely furnished. Iron bedsteads, lumpy mattresses filled with horsehair or straw, and maybe a washstand if they were lucky. They had no privacy. Your roommate knew everything about you. How you snored, how you cried after the cook yelled at you, how you hid a ribbon you found in the street because it was the only pretty thing you owned. And they were tired. Bone tired. A maid walked an average of 20 miles a day inside the house, up and down, carrying coal scuttles, hot water cans, trays of food, piles of laundry. Their legs were constantly aching. Varicose veins were just part of the uniform, but there was a hierarchy even in the misery. The lady's maid looked down on the housemaid. The housemaid looked down on the kitchen maid. The kitchen maid looked down on the scullery maid. And the scullery maid, well, she probably looked down on the cat. The lady's maid was an interesting character. She was the mistress's personal shadow. She didn't do the heavy cleaning. Her hands were soft. She dressed the mistress, brushed her hair, read to her, and listened to her complain about how hard it was to schedule tea with Lady Ponsonby. The lady's maid was often considered stuck-up by the other servants. She wore the mistress's cast-off clothes, so she walked around the basement in silk dresses that were slightly out of fashion, looking like a time traveler who missed her stop. She was in a precarious position. She was close to power, but she had no power herself. If the mistress was in a bad mood, the lady's maid was the first to know. A pin placed wrongly in a corset could result in a tantrum. A hair out of place could mean dismissal. She had to be a psychologist, a hairdresser, and a seamstress all rolled into one, paid in old dresses, and the occasional half-day off. Speaking of time off, let's talk about that, or the lack thereof. In 1888, a servant might get one afternoon off a week, maybe every other Sunday. That was it. And even they had to be back by a certain time, usually before the family dinner, so they could serve. On their time off, they would walk, just walk. Maybe go to the park. Maybe visit a relative, if they lived close by. But mostly, they just wanted to be somewhere that wasn't there. They had to ask permission to go out. They had to ask permission to have a visitor. They were adults, often supporting families back home in the country, but they were treated like children in a boarding school, run by a particularly strict headmaster. No followers allowed was a common rule. That meant no boyfriends. No dating. If you were a maid, you were expected to be celibate, because obviously, romance interferes with the dusting. If a maid got pregnant, instant dismissal. No reference. Out on the street. And in 1888, the street was not a friendly place. It was the world of the casual wards, the workhouses, and the dark corners of Whitechapel. The fear of losing your character, your ephrus, was the leash that kept everyone in line. You could put up with a lot of screaming from the cook, if the alternative was the workhouse. So, you have this pressure cooker environment. Dozens of people living in a confined space, overworked, sleep-deprived, fed on leftovers, and constantly watched. It's a reality show waiting to happen, but without the confessionals or the prize money, just endless, repetitive labor. And yet, they took pride in it. That's the twist. The butler took pride in the shine of the silver. The housemaid took pride in the perfect fold of the bedsheet. They internalized the values of the people who exploited them. They measured their self-worth by the cleanliness of a stranger's house. It's a bit sad, really. A bit tragic. But it was also survival. You have to care about the silver, because if you don't, you might start asking yourself why you're spending your one wild and precious life polishing it. And that is a dangerous question to ask on the backstairs of a Victorian townhouse. Now, as we drift a bit deeper into this smoggy night, let's think about the laundry. Because if the kitchen was the stomach of the house, the laundry was its liver filtering out the dirt. Monday was wash day, and in 1888, wash day was a weekly apocalypse. So, we've finally reached the inner sanctum, the nerve center of the domestic machine. We are standing outside the door of the housekeeper. If the butler was the king of the basement, the housekeeper was the Iron Chancellor. In a large Victorian house, she was a terrifying figure. She was usually a widow, Or at least she claimed to be, because Mrs. was a title of respect. Regardless of whether there had ever been a Mr. She wore black silk always. Black silk, a thought rustled when she walked. The rustle was a warning system. It said, "Look busy. I'm coming to inspect the lint." Her most important accessory wasn't jewelry. It was the chatelaine. This was a heavy silver belt hook from which dangled a massive collection of keys. The keys to the linen cupboard. The keys to the china closet. The keys to the pantry. The keys to the jam store. She jingled when she moved. She was a walking jailer of dry goods. Her room was often called the pug's parlor by the lower servants. Why? Because historically, housekeepers had a fondness for pug dogs more. Grumpy, breathing, challenged creatures that mirrored their owners' temperaments. Also, because only the upper servants were allowed in there. The steward, the butler, maybe the head housemaid if she was being scolded. For a scullery maid to enter the pug's parlor was like a peasant being summoned to the principal's office. It was the most comfortable room downstairs. It had a real rug. It had chintz, armchairs. It had framed photos of the family she served, arranged on the mantelpiece as if they were her own children, which is both sweet and slightly delusional. She essentially adopted the family's history, because she had none of her own allowed. Her main job, aside from terrorizing the maids, was the stores. You see, the Victorians didn't trust anyone, especially not the people making their food. They were convinced that if you left a bag of sugar unlocked, the servants would eat it all in one sitting like sugar-crazed raccoons. So everything was locked up. Tea, coffee, spices, candles, soap. Every morning there was a ritual called giving out. The cook had to come to the housekeeper's room with a list. "I need 3 pounds of flour, Mrs. Grimshaw. 3 pounds. We used 3 pounds on Tuesday. Are you making bricks? The master wants a sponge cake. Very well, but I shall be weighing the result." She would unlock the cupboards, weigh out the exact amount of flour, sugar, and tea leaves on a set of brass scales, and then lock the cupboards again. It was a daily battle over grams of dust. Tea was the currency of the basement. The servants were given a tea allowance, usually 2 ounces a week. That's not a lot of tea for people who work 16 hours a day. So they treasured it. They would rebrew the leaves until the water was basically just hot and slightly brown. The housekeeper, of course, had her own stash of the good stuff from the family's supply, which she drank in her parlor with the butler, discussing the moral failings of the footman. The housekeeper was also the guardian of the linen. The linen cupboard was her vault. Victorian households had hundreds of sheets, tablecloths, and napkins. Each one was embroidered with the family crest and a number. She had a ledger. If napkin number 42 was missing, she knew. She would hunt it down. "Where is the damask napkin with the ink stain on the corner?" "Mary, I think the master used it to wipe his boots." "Ma'am, sacrilege." She spent her evenings mending, darning, patching. A good housekeeper could keep a sheet in rotation for 20 years. It was a point of pride. To throw something away was a moral failure. But there was a sadness to her, too. She was often a woman who had come down in the world. Maybe a farmer's daughter, or a shopkeeper's widow. She had authority. Yes, but she was trapped. She lived in a house that wasn't hers, protecting possessions she didn't own, for a family that viewed her as a piece of high-functioning machinery, and as 1888 rolled on, the cracks were starting to show. You couldn't see them yet. Maybe. The silver was still shiny. The starch was still stiff. But the world outside was getting louder. The new unionism was starting to rumble in the factories. Women were starting to ask why they couldn't vote, and technology was creeping in. Gas lighting was being replaced by electricity in the very richest houses. And do you know what electricity does? It reveals the dirt. Gaslight is soft, yellow, forgiving. Electric light is harsh, white, and honest. Suddenly, the corners didn't look so clean. The velvet looked a bit dusty. The illusion of perfection was harder to maintain. And the vacuum cleaner was coming. The washing machine was coming. Not yet. Not really. But the idea of them. The idea that a machine could do the work of 3 maids. The younger generation of servants was getting restless. They didn't want to live in a cupboard. They didn't want to ask permission to walk in the park. They were reading those penny dreadfuls and thinking, Maybe I'll go work in a shop. Or a factory. At least there, when the bell rings at 6 p.m., I can go home. The servant problem was the favorite topic of conversation at dinner parties. You just can't get good help these days. I know. My footman asked for a raise. Imagine they didn't realize it. But they were watching the slow, agonizing death of their own lifestyle. The Great War was still decades away, but the feudal system of the Victorian house was already on life support. It was just too expensive, too inefficient, and too dehumanizing to last forever. But for now, in 1888, the machine still hums. The housekeeper locks her door. The butler checks the locks on the silver chess. The scullery maid blows out her candle which she paid for herself and curls up on her lumpy mattress. The fog outside is thick. The gas lamps on the street are just glowing orbs in the gloom. The hansom cabs have stopped. The house breathes. It settles. The floorboards creak as the temperature drops. Somewhere, a mouse scuttles behind the wainscoting, safe in the knowledge that the cat is asleep on the cook's chair. It's a world of rigid order, of silence, of polished surfaces and hidden dust. A world where everyone knows their place, even if that place is a cold attic or a damp basement. And as we leave them there, frozen in this sepia-toned moment, let's just appreciate the fact that we don't have to get up at 5 a.m. to blackly degrade. We don't have to iron a newspaper. And we definitely don't have to eat toast water. So, turn off the light, let the modern world fade away for a few hours. The servants are asleep. The bells are silent. And the only thing you have to do is drift off. Good night, guys. So, we are now deep in the belly of the house. We've talked about the attic, where the maids froze, and the kitchen where the cook melted. But we haven't really talked about the spaces in between. The service corridors. The architectural equivalent of a secret passage, but without any of the cool treasure or hidden levers. Just narrow, dark hallways that smelled faintly of beeswax and repressed emotions. The most important feature of any proper Victorian house was the green baize door. You've probably seen it in dramas. It's a heavy door, covered in green felt baize studded with brass tacks. It wasn't just a door, it was a noise dampener. It was the airlock between two different planets. On one side, thick carpets, oil paintings of ancestors who looked disappointed in you, and the faint scent of potpourri. On the other side, stone flags, bare walls, the smell of boiling cabbage, and the sound of the scullery maid dropping a saucepan. The green baize door was the border control, and you did not cross it without a reason. If you were a servant, your entire goal was to be invisible. The corridors were designed for this. They were often built inside the walls of the main rooms or tucked behind staircases, so the family never had to see a bucket of dirty water being carried past them. There was a rule, unwritten but strictly enforced. If you were walking down a corridor and you encountered a member of the family, you had to efface yourself. You had to press yourself against the wall, eyes downcast, and become part of the wallpaper. You were not a person. You were a utility. Imagine living your life, playing a permanent game of hide-and-seek, where the seeker is your boss and the penalty for being found is a stern lecture on knowing your place. And silence. Always silence. The servants wore felt-soled slippers in the morning, so they wouldn't wake the family. Can you imagine shuffling around a 4-story house in soft shoes, trying to clean a fireplace without clinking the poker against the grate? It requires the dexterity of a cat burglar. But even in this prison of silence, the human heart wants what it wants. And in 1888, what the human heart wanted, especially the heart of a young kitchen maid, was a follower. A follower was the Victorian term for a boyfriend, a suitor, or just a guy you stared at awkwardly for 20 minutes. And they were strictly, absolutely forbidden. No followers allowed. It was the standard clause in every employment contract. Why? Because the Victorians were terrified of servant sexuality. They believed that if you let a maid have a boyfriend, she would inevitably become distracted, break the china, or worse, get pregnant and bring shame upon the house. So, romance went underground. Or rather, it went to the area. The area was the sunken patio space in front of the basement kitchen, reachable from the street by a set of steep iron stairs. This was the service entrance. It was a dark, damp, little concrete canyon below the sidewalk, and it was the hottest dating spot in London. This is where the phenomenon of cupboard love comes from. The local policeman, the Bobby, would walk his beat past the house. He'd glance down into the area. The cook or the kitchen maid, if the coast was clear, might be down there shaking a rug. Words would be exchanged. "Evening, miss." "Evening, constable." "Quiet night then." "Oh, very quiet." "Cook's in a mood, though." And then, if things were getting serious, food would be involved. The maid might slip him a cold mutton pie or a slice of the master's ham through the railings. Hence, cupboard love, affection bought with the contents of the larder. The policeman got a snack. The maid got 5 minutes of male attention, and everyone felt a little less lonely. But the risk was enormous. If the master came home early and saw a policeman leaning over his railings, eating his ham, that was it. Instant dismissal. Giddiness was the charge. A giddy maid was a liability, and if you were fired without a character, a written reference sue were finished. You couldn't get another job in a respectable house. You'd slide down the social ladder to a boarding house, then a laundry, and then, well, the streets. The character was your passport. It was a piece of paper that said, "This person is sober, honest, and not currently pregnant." Without it, you were a ghost. So, romance was high stakes. It was thrilling. A letter received from a young man was a treasure, but servants rarely had private mail. The master or mistress would often check the post. If a letter arrived for a maid in a masculine hand, questions would be asked. "Who is this Mr. Albert Higgins?" "Mary." "Just my cousin." "Ma'am, you have a lot of cousins." "Mary." And they all seemed to live in the barracks. So they used code names. They had letters sent to the local shop instead of the house. It was a clandestine operation worthy of a spy novel. And speaking of novels, let's talk about what they did when they weren't flirting with policemen or scrubbing floors. They read. Literacy was actually quite high among servants in 1888. You had to be able to read to follow recipes or read the labels on the medicine bottles. But they weren't reading Shakespeare. They were reading penny dreadfuls. These were the pulp fiction of the era. Cheap weekly magazines printed on terrible paper that cost you guessed a penny. They had titles like Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood and the String of Pearls, which introduced Sweeney Todd, the demon barber. Picture the scene. It's 10 p.m. The house is quiet. The servants are in the kitchen or the hall. The gas is turned low to save money. One of them, maybe the second footman, who has the best eyesight, is reading aloud. And then, with a ghastly shriek, the spectre rose from the tomb. The maids are huddled together, shivering. The cook is pretending not to listen but has stopped kneading the dough. It was escapism. Their lives were dull, repetitive, and controlled, so they loved stories about murder, mayhem, and ghosts. It made the dark corners of the scullery seem a little more interesting, if a lot more terrifying. There was a wonderful irony in it. Upstairs, the family was reading improving literature poetry, sermons, maybe a dense novel by George Eliot if they were feeling wild. Downstairs, the servants were reading about severed heads and haunted castles. But Sunday was the one day where the rules bent slightly. Sunday was church day. Religion was the great excuse. Even the strictest master had to let the servants go to church. It was a moral obligation. So, on Sunday mornings, or evenings, the servants would troop out in their best clothes. For many, this was the only social life they had. Church wasn't just about the sermon. It was about the walk, there and back. It was about seeing other people who weren't the 6 people you lived with. It was about wearing a hat that wasn't a mob cap. The Sunday best was a crucial concept. A maid might spend her entire year's savings on one decent dress, a bit of ribbon, and a pair of gloves. Because for those 2 hours on a Sunday, she wasn't the girl. She was a person. She could walk down the street and look like a lady. Of course, the upper classes hated this. They constantly complained that you couldn't tell the maids from the mistresses anymore on a Sunday. They found it confusing and socially dangerous. "Why is that girl wearing silk?" She scrubs floors. But for the maid, that silk was armor. It was dignity. After church, if they were lucky, they might get a half day. This usually meant from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m. 6 hours of freedom. What did they do? They walked. London in 1888 had Parkside Park, Regent's Park. They would go there and just sit. Watch the carriages. Ideally, they'd meet a friend or a cousin, wink wink. But they had to be careful. A servant in uniform was invisible. A servant in regular clothes was suspicious. If they went to a pub, scandalous. If they went to a music hall, unthinkable. Those were dens of iniquity. So, mostly, they walked. They visited family, if they were Londoners. If they were from the country, which many were, they were stuck. They might visit a friend in service at another house. "Oh, come to number 42. We're having tea." And they would sit in another basement, drinking tea, complaining about their mistress. It was a boosman's holiday. But let's not forget the sheer physical toll of all this. By the time Sunday night rolled around, they were exhausted. The housemaid's knee was a real medical condition, bursitis, caused by kneeling on hard floors for hours. Their hands were chapped. Their backs ached. And yet, they had to be back by 9 p.m. sharp. The door would be locked. If you were late, you might find your box, your trunk on the doorstep the next morning. The fear of the lockout was real. You'd see servants running through the foggy streets at 8:55 p.m., desperate to beat the clock, because the master would often stand by the door with his pocket watch, just waiting to catch someone out. It was a power trip. "Ah, Jenkins, 9:02 p.m. This is a very slippery slope to anarchy." So, the week would end. They would hang up their Sunday best, put the apron back on, and prepare for Monday. And we know what happens on Monday. The copper boils. The steam rises. The cycle begins again. But before we wrap up our tour of this house, I want to talk about one final, crucial member of the staff we haven't met yet. The one who really ran the show. The housekeeper. Mrs. Danvers without the arson, usually. She carried the keys. She controlled the sugar. And she knew where the bodies were buried. Sometimes literally if the drains were bad. Let's drift towards her sitting room. The pug's parlor, as the lower servants called it. So, we've survived Monday's washing marathon. Congratulations, but don't celebrate just yet, because it's Tuesday, and in the rigid, unyielding calendar of the Victorian household, Tuesday means ironing. Now, you might think, ironing? I do that while watching Netflix. No, you don't understand. In 1888, ironing was an extreme sport. It was dangerous. It was heavy. It involved handling lumps of cast iron that had been sitting in a fire. They were called sad irons. And while it's tempting to think they were named after the emotional state of the women using them, which would be accurate, the word sad actually meant solid or heavy in Old English. And heavy they were. A standard iron weighed anywhere from 5 to 9 pounds. You needed 2 of them. One was always heating on the stove the range, while you used the other one. When the one in your hand cooled down, which happened in about 5 minutes, you swapped them. You grabbed the handle with a thick cloth holder, because the handle was also metal, and also approximately the temperature of the sun. There was no thermostat. You couldn't set it to silk or cotton. You had to guess. And how did a Victorian laundry maid test the temperature? She spat on Italiano. Yes. She would gather a little saliva and let it sizzle on the bottom of the iron. If it bounced off instantly with a sharp hiss, it was hot enough for linen. If it just sort of fizzled sadly, it was too cold. If it evaporated before it even hit the metal, it was too hot and would burn a hole straight through the master's favorite cravat. And God forbid you scorched something. Scorching was a capital offense. If you left a brown mark on a white shirt, you might be docked a week's wages. So you were constantly playing a high-stakes game of temperature roulette. And the clothes. Have you seen Victorian clothes? They weren't flat. They were 3-dimensional puzzles made of fabric. Ruffles, pleats, gathers, tucks lace, puffed sleeves, a single ladyess. Blouse could have 3 different types of lace and 42 tiny pleats down the front. You had to use special goffering irons, which looked like heated curling tongs to get into the ruffles. You had 2 O's polishing irons with rounded bottoms to make the starched shirt fronts shine like plastic. It was an art form. A maid could spend 45 minutes on a single shirt, and she had to do dozens of them, standing up, in a hot room, for 10 hours. But let's put down the heavy iron for a moment and look at something else the Victorians were obsessed with. If they loved cleanliness, they absolutely adored death. In 1888, Queen Victoria was still very much in her Widow of Windsor phase, wearing black for decades after Prince Albert died. She made grief fashionable, and because the aristocracy copied the Queen, and the middle class copied the aristocracy, the entire country was essentially participating in a competitive mourning tournament. For the servants, a death in the house was a logistical nightmare. Fiercest of all, the house itself had to be dressed. Yes, the house had to wear mourning clothes. The moment someone died, let's say, the master finally succumbed to his gout or a bout of bad air, the blinds were drawn. All of them, the house was plunged into darkness. Tin comate crepe. Black crepe was a scratchy, crimped silk fabric that looked matte and depressing. The servants had to tie boughs of it on the door knocker. This was the Victorian equivalent of a Facebook status update. It told the neighbors, "We are sad. Please do not visit unless you are also sad." They covered the mirrors. Why? Superstition, mostly. Some said it was so the spirit of the deceased wouldn't get trapped in the glass. Others said it was simply because vanity was inappropriate when death was in the room, so the housemaids had to run around draping black cloth over every reflective surface. It made the house feel like a very dark, very soft KB, and then the servants themselves had to go into mourning. This was tricky. The family would obviously order new, expensive black wardrobes. But for the servants, it depended on how generous the family was. A wealthy family would pay for mourning livery, black suits for the men, black dresses with black caps and aprons for the women. But a cheaper family, they might just give the servants a few shillings and tell them to dye what you have. So you'd have the maids boiling their regular dresses in vats of black dye in the wash-house. The smell of boiling dye is pungent. And often it didn't take well. You'd end up with a sort of streaky, purplish-black dress that stained your skin. Imagine sweating in a hand-dyed dress while serving soup and realizing your neck is turning slowly purple. The hierarchy of grief was strict. The butler and the housekeeper were expected to mourn the deepest. They wore the full weeper's black bands on their arms or hats. The lower servants were just expected to look generally miserable. There were mutes involved too. These were professional mourners, men hired by the undertaker to stand outside the front door, looking gloomy. They wore top hats with long trailing ribbons called weepers. Their only job was to stand there and look sad. They were often paid in gin, so by the afternoon you might have 2 very drunk, very sad-looking men propping each other up on your front porch. The footman would have to go out and gently suggest they lean against the wall instead of the door. The funeral itself was a massive production. The pomps, funibris, feathers on the horses, velvet drapes on the carriage. And the food, the funeral baked meats. The cook had to prepare a massive feast for the wake. Ham, cold tongue, sherry, cake, lots of cake. Funeral biscuits were a real thing. Shortbread cookies, wrapped in paper printed with a poem about death. He has gone to the shore, where the waves are no more. Enjoy your cookie. The servants had to serve this feast to a house full of distant relatives who were mostly there to see if they were in the will. It was tense. The black sheep of the family would show up, the cousin who drank too much, the nephew who ran off to sea. The butler had to navigate all this social landmining, making sure Uncle Arthur didn't get too close to the sherry decanter. And let's be honest, the servants often didn't really care that the master was dead. He might have been a tyrant. He might have shouted at them daily. But they had to perform grief. They had to sniffle at the right moments. If a maid was caught laughing in the kitchen while the master was lying in state in the parlor, she could be fired for heartlessness. So they became actors. "Oh, poor Mr. Ponsonby," the cook would say, wiping a dry eye with a floury hand. "He did love his kidney pudding." "Yes," the butler would reply solemnly. He was a man of distinct tastes. And then they would go back to polishing the silver, because the new master would be taking over, and he would want his forks to shine just as brightly. The transition of power was stressful. Would the new master keep the old staff, or would he bring his own people? The death of an employer was a time of huge insecurity. You could be out on the street with nothing but a black armband and a reference letter that said you were proficient at mourning. But let's slide away from the gloom of the funeral parlor and look at something a bit more lively. Or at least, attempting to be. Let's talk about the health of the Victorians, because if they weren't dying, they were convinced they were about to die. The Victorian medicine cabinet was a house of horrors, and guess who had to administer it? The servants. Hypochondria was the national pastime of the upper class. They had nerves, they had vapors, they had sluggish livers, and the cures were often worse than the diseases. Let's take the vapors. This was a catch-all term for when a lady felt faint, or bored, or just didn't want to deal with a situation. She would collapse onto a chaise longue. The lady's maid would have to rush in with smelling salts. Smelling salts are basically ammonia. Ammonium carbonate. It smells like a cat litter box that has been set on fire. The maid would wave this under the mistress's nose, and the shock of the chemical burn in her nostrils would revive her. Oh, thank you, gang. I felt quite overcome by the pattern of that wallpaper. And then there were the tonics. Laudanum. You've heard of it. It's opium dissolved in alcohol. It was sold over the counter. It was the aspirin of 1888, teething baby. Laudanum, headache. Laudanum. Sad because it's raining. Laudanum. The bottle would sit on the bedside table. The maid would have to measure out the drops. Just 10 drops? My lady, make it 20. I want to sleep through the winter. It was an era of casual, socially acceptable drug use, and the servants saw the results. The glassy eyes at breakfast, the slow days where the mistress just sat staring at a embroidery hoop for 4 hours without moving. But the most feared medical duty was the invalid diet. When someone was sick, they were put on a diet of bland, white foods. Beef tea gruel, toast water. Yes, toast water. You toast a piece of bread until it's black. Then you pour boiling water over it, let it cool, strain it, and drink the brown water. It was supposed to be restorative. It tasted like wet charcoal. The kitchen maid had to make jugs of this stuff. Is the toast water ready? Yes, Mrs. Patmore. It looks suitably depressing. The invalid would lay in bed, surrounded by pillows, ringing the bell every 5 minutes for more toast water, or to have their pillows fluffed, or to complain that the coal fire was making a noise. The sick room was a domain unto itself. The blinds were drawn again. Straw was laid down on the street, outside the house literally. Piles of straw on the cobblestones to muffle the sound of carriage wheels, so the patient wouldn't be disturbed. The footman had to go out and spread the straw. Imagine that level of entitlement. I have a headache, so please silence the entire street. But eventually, the invalid would either recover or, well, we've covered the alternative, and life below stairs would go on. The great wheel of the household kept turning, greased by tea, elbow grease, and the silent, invisible labor of the people in the aprons. Now, as we move into the deeper hours of the night, I want to take you somewhere you weren't supposed to go. We've seen the attic, the basement, the dining room, but there were secret places, hidden passages, the service corridors. These were the veins of the house, designed so the servants could move from room to room without ever being seen by the family. They were narrow, dark, and often unheated, a labyrinth behind the walls. So, Monday, in the modern world, Monday is just the day you forget your password and spill coffee on your shirt. But in a Victorian household, Monday was a war crime. It was wash day. If the house was a living organism, wash day was when it decided to sweat itself clean, and the servants were the ones catching the perspiration. It usually started again in the middle of the night, around 4 a.m. The laundry maids, or the washerwomen, if the household hired extra muscle and they were muscle, would drag themselves out of bed. They headed to the wash house, which was usually a damp, stone-floored room in the basement. or an outbuilding that felt like a cave designed by someone who hated comfort. The technology was primitive. We're talking about the copper. Not the metal, but a giant, brick-tin cauldron that had to be filled with buckets of water and then boiled over a coal fire. Imagine making soup, but the soup is 50 pounds of dirty linen, and the chef is exhausted. The smell was specific. It was a mix of boiling soap, lye, sweat, and the inescapable scent of wet wool, which smells like a sheep that's given up on life. They used soda and blue. Soda was harsh, caustic stuff that ate away at the skin. By noon, a washerwoman's hands were essentially parboiled. They were red, swollen, and sodden, and they were scrubbing. Rubbing boards, scrubbing brushes, knuckles against fabric, sheets, tablecloths, undergarments. The sheer volume of fabric a Victorian family went through is mind-boggling. They wore layers upon layers. A woman wasn't just wearing a dress. She was wearing a chemise, drawers, a corset cover, petticoats plural, and then the dress. And all of it had to be washed. Then came the mingle. It sounds like a medieval torture device, and honestly, it basically was. It was a machine with two heavy wooden rollers that you cranked by hand to squeeze the water out of the clothes. It required significant upper body strength. If you got your finger caught in it, well, let's just say workplace safety regulations were not. You just tried not to scream because it might disturb the master's toast. Drying was the next nightmare. In London, you couldn't really hang things outside. The air was full of soot, remember? If you hung a white sheet outside in 1888, you brought back a gray sheet with black speckles. So, things were dried indoors. Wooden racks were hauled up to the ceiling in the kitchen or the laundry room. The whole basement became a sauna of evaporating laundry water. The windows steamed up, the walls dripped, and the cook would start shouting because the humidity was making her pastry soggy. It was a 12 to 14-hour day of physical labor that would make a CrossFit athlete cry. And the reward? You got to do it all again next Monday. Let's leave the steam and float up a few flights of stairs, past the kitchen, past the dining room, all the way up to the schoolroom. Here, we find the most awkward person in the entire house. The governess. If the scullery maid was the lowest of the low, the governess was the social anomaly. She was the glitch in the matrix. Usually, she was a woman from a good family that had lost its money. Maybe her father was a clergyman who died, or a businessman who made a bad investment in South American railways. She was educated. She spoke French. She could play the piano, but she was poor. This put her in a terrible position. She wasn't a servant. Technically, she was a lady. So she couldn't eat in the servants' hall with the footman and the cook. That would be beneath her dignity. But she wasn't family, either. So she couldn't eat in the dining room with the master and mistress. That would be above her station. So, where did she eat? Usually alone, in the schoolroom, on a tray, or with the children, who were often, to put it mildly, little sociopaths in velvet suits. Her life was incredibly lonely. The servants hated her because she was stuck up and poor, a bad combination. They saw her as extra work. A maid had to carry her meals up, clean her room, and empty her chamber pot, even though the governess didn't pay her wages. So the maids would often be petty. They'd bring her tea, cold. They'd forget to bring her coal for the fire. And the family. To them, she was a piece of furniture that taught grammar. The master would ignore her in the hallway. The mistress would treat her with a sort of distant, condescending kindness, like you treat a stray dog you're not planning to keep. She was expected to be invisible when guests came over, perhaps playing the piano in the background while everyone else socialized, providing a live soundtrack to a party she wasn't invited to. And let's talk about the children she was raising. Victorian upper-class children were weird. They were often kept separate from their parents, living in the nursery wing like a distinct tribe. They saw their mother for maybe an hour, a day the children's hour, where they were scrubbed clean, dressed in their best clothes, and brought down to the drawing room to be inspected. Hello, mother. Hello, darling. You look well. Now go away. That was the extent of the parenting. The rest of the time, the governess was the parent, the teacher, and the punching bag. If the children were brats and money, because they were being raised to believe they were better than everyone else, She couldn't really discipline them. If she scolded the little heir too harshly, he'd run to Mama, and the governess would get a lecture on being too severe. So she sat in the schoolroom, listening to a 7-year-old butcher the French language, staring out the window at the grey London sky, knowing she would probably never marry, never have a home of her own, and die in a distressed gentlewomen's home, funded by charity. It was a life of quiet, genteel desperation, wrapped in a high collar. Speaking of desperation, let's talk about the hygiene of the people she worked for. Or rather, the lack of plumbing. We see these grand houses in movies, all chandeliers and ballrooms. But we forget that in 1888, very few of them had bathrooms as we know them. Indoor plumbing was still a novelty for the super rich. And even then, it was often just one water closet for the whole house. So, how did they wash? The hip bath. This was a logistical nightmare for the servants. A hip bath is basically a large tin bucket shaped like a weird armchair. It was kept in the bedroom or a dressing room. To fill it, the housemaids had to carry heavy cans of hot water up the stairs again. The stairs, gallon after gallon. Then, they had to bring up cold water to mix it. Then, towels. Soap. The master or mistress would sit in this tin bucket, knees probably hitting their chin, splash around for a bit, and then get out. And then, the water didn't just disappear. The maids had to bail it out, bucket by bucket, and carry the dirty, soapy, grey water back down the stairs to the scullery sink or a drain outside. Imagine doing that 4 times a day for different family members. It's a wonder the maids didn't have biceps like bodybuilders. And then there were the chamber pots, the slop pails. Every morning, the housemaids had to go into every bedroom, take the chamber pots from under the beds filled with the unmentionable results of the night and empty them into a larger slop pail they carried around. Then they had to clean the pots, dry them, and put them back. They called this the slops. It was the most degrading job in the house, usually reserved for the youngest maid. You can see why the turnover rate for young maids was high. One week you're dreaming of London life, the next you're a professional carrier of human waste. But despite the filth, the upper classes were obsessed with airs. Not just attitudes, but actual air. They were terrified of drafts, yet also terrified of stale air. It was a contradiction. They would seal the windows shut to keep out the miasma bad air that causes disease, but then complain of and they were helpless. Truly, deeply helpless. This is where the valet and the lady's maid come back in. The valet, pronounced valet, never valet, in the British aristocracy. If you want a bit pedantic, which we do, was the male equivalent of the lady's maid, his job was to dress the master. I don't mean he laid out the clothes. I mean he put them on him. There are records of aristocrats who didn't know how to tie their own shoelaces because they'd never done it. Why would they? That's what Genkins is for. The valet had some truly bizarre duties. He had to iron the shoelaces so they lay flat. He had to use a special little brush to clean the master's hats. And my personal favorite, he had to iron the morning newspaper. Yes, you heard that right. He had to iron the Times. Why? 2 reasons. First, to dry the ink so the master's fingers wouldn't get black. And second, because a crisp, warm newspaper is apparently the height of luxury. Imagine that. Your job is to iron paper. If you burned it, you were in trouble. If it wasn't warm enough, you were in trouble. You were a servant to the news cycle. Literally. And the lady's maid, she was dealing with the corset. The corset in the 1880s was a serious piece of structural engineering. It had steel boning. It was stiff, heavy, and unyielding. Lazing a woman into one was a 2-person job, or at least a very strenuous 1-person job. The maid would have to brace her foot against the bed frame and pull. The mistress would hold her breath. "Tighter, Mary. I think your ribs might snap, my lady." Nonsense. Tighter. It was a daily ritual of compression. And then came the hair. The elaborate updos of the late Victorian era weren't natural. They used rats' pads of hair, sometimes the mistress's own saved hair from her brush, sometimes horsehair stuffed into the style to give it volume. The lady's maid had to build these sculptures every morning, and take them down every night. She was an architect of frizz. There was a strange intimacy to it. The valet and the lady's maid saw their employers naked, vulnerable, sick, and hungover. They saw the bruises, the rashes, the aging bodies, and yet the barrier remained. The master would stand there in his underwear, completely ignoring the presence of the man polishing his boots, as if the servant were a robot. It's a level of dehumanization that's hard to wrap your head around. To be so close to someone, to touch their skin, to know the smell of their breath in the morning, and yet to be miles apart socially. But as the afternoon wore on in our 1888 house, the tension would start to build. Because evening was coming, and evening meant dinner. And dinner in the Victorian era wasn't just a meal. It was a theatrical production, with high stakes, fragile props, and a very critical audience. The basement was about to shift into high gear. The footmen were powdering their hair again. The cook was screaming about the fish, and the butler was uncorking the wine, checking the label to make sure he wasn't accidentally serving the good stuff to the boring cousins who were coming over. So, the sun has gone down over London. The fog outside is now officially a health hazard, thick enough to chew on, but inside the townhouse, the gas jets are hissing to life. It's showtime. If the day was about scrubbing the invisible dirt, the evening is about performing the visible wealth. The Victorian dinner party wasn't tihustamil. It was a contact sport, played with silverware. And the referees were the servants, who were also the players, the equipment managers, and the people cleaning the stadium afterwards. Let's float into the dining room about an hour before the guests arrive. The butler is in there. He is in a state of high anxiety, though you'd never know it because his face is stuck in that permanent expression of mild disappointment that all good butlers master. He is measuring the table. Literally. He has a measuring stick. In 1888, symmetry was God. The forks had to be exactly 2 inches from the edge of the table. The glasses had to form a precise diagonal line. The napkins were folded into intricate shapes that defied physics. The bishop's mitre, the water lily, the artichoke. Imagine spending 20 minutes folding a piece of linen into a swan just so a heavy-set banker can wipe gravy on it later. The table itself was a minefield of crystal and silver. We're talking 5 or 6 glasses per person. Sherry, white wine, red wine, champagne, port, water. It looked less like a place to eat and more like a glass factory exploded, and the butler had to polish every single one of them. If there was a smudge, a single rogue fingerprint on a wine glass, it was a personal failure. He would breathe on it, polish it with a special leather chamois, and hold it up to the light like he was inspecting a diamond. Then the guests arrive. The footmen, our tall friends with the padded calves, are now standing in the hall like statues. They are not allowed to speak. They are not allowed to smile. They are furniture that breathes. When the doorbell rings, they glide to open it in unison. It's a choreographed dance. One takes the hat, one takes the coat, one announces the guest. Mr. and Mrs. Ponsonbus. The names are shouted up the stairs, relayed from footman to footman like a game of telephone, until they reach the drawing room. Now, let's talk about service à la Ross. This was the trendy new style of dining in the 1880s. Before this, they used service à la Francaise, where all the food was put on the table at once, like a buffet, and people grabbed what they wanted. It was messy, and the food got cold. But the Russians, apparently, knew better. In service à la Russe, the table is just decoration flowers, fruit, candles. The food is carved by the butler at the sideboard and then carried around to each guest by the footman. This sounds efficient, but for the footman, it was a nightmare. They had to balance heavy silver platters scorching hot on one hand, lean over the guest's left shoulder, and lower the platter to the exact height where the guest could help themselves. Imagine doing a lunge while holding a 10-pound roast beef on a silver tray, while wearing tight breeches and trying not to drop gravy on a lady's silk dress. If the guest was slow or indecisive, oh, I don't know. Should I have the grouse? The footman just had to stay there, trembling slightly, his arm muscles screaming, while the guest pondered the poultry, and they had to be silent. The silent service. The butler directed them with glances. A raised eyebrow meant refill the wine. A slight nod meant clear the plates. A glary meant you are breathing too loudly. Stop it. It was a telepathic command center running on fear and adrenaline. And the food. Oh, the Victorian obsession with food presentation. Everything was disguised. They hated food that looked like what it was. A fish cold in tea. Just to be a fish. It had to be skinned, deboned, mashed into a paste, mixed with cream, put back into the skin, and sewn up to look like a fish again. Why? Because they had too much time on their hands. And then there was aspic. The Victorians loved jelly, meat jelly, savory jelly. They would boil down calves' hooves to make gelatin, and then encase everything in it. Tongues, eggs, vegetables, entire chickens. It was like they wanted to preserve their dinner for future archaeologists. The cook would spend hours clarifying the stock to make the jelly clear, pouring it into molds, and praying it would set. If the jelly collapsed on the way to the table, catastrophe. The cook might actually cry. The butler would look grave. The footman would have to serve a puddle of meat-flavored slush with a straight face. The dinner would go on for hours. 8 courses, 10 courses, soup, fish, entree, and roast, game, salad, sweets, savory, dessert, coffee. It was an endurance test for the stomach, and the servants didn't eat until the family was finished. So while they were serving this mountain of food, they were often starving. The smell of roasting venison wafting into their faces while their stomachs growled was a special kind of torture. But eventually, the ladies would withdraw to the drawing room, leaving the men to drink port and smoke cigars. This was the signal for the cleanup to begin. And if the dinner was a ballet, the cleanup was a frantic, silent riot. The silver had to be counted immediately. The butler would count every fork, every spoon, every knife. If a teaspoon was missing, nobody went to bed until it was found. Usually, it had been accidentally thrown into the hog bucket with the scraps. So yes, the footman would have to go digging through the discarded potato peelings and fish bones to find a silver spoon. The china-fine, delicate porcelain couldn't be washed in the main sink. It was too risky. It was washed in wooden tubs lined with lead to prevent chipping. The water had to be just the right temperature. Too hot, the glaze cracks. Too cold, the grease doesn't come off. And remember, no rubber gloves, just hands. The scullery maid, our friend from the basement, was now facing her own personal Everest. The pots and pans, the copper pans that had been used to cook the 10-course meal, were now caked with burnt sauce, soot, and grease. She had to scrub them with sand and vinegar until they shone again. She would often be working until midnight or 1 a.m., her arms aching, her apron soaked. But let's shift the mood a bit, because once the work was finally done, or at least paused, there was the servants' hall. This was their living room. It was usually a long, sterile room in the basement, with a big table. And here, hierarchy was everything. The butler sat at the head of the table, the cook sat at the other end. The rest sat in order of rank. They even addressed each other by their masters' names. The valet of Lord Ponsonby would be called Lord Ponsonby by the other servants. It was a weird role-playing game. Pass the salt. Lord Ponsonby. Certainly, Duke of Marlborough. It was a way of borrowing status. They mimicked the manners of the people upstairs. They were snobs about it. A butler from a ducal household would look down on a butler from a mere earl's household. Oh, you only have 2 footmen? How quaint. And what did they do for fun? They drank. Alcohol was a huge part of servant life. It was often part of their wages. They were given a beer allowance. Even the young maids. It was safer than the water, usually, and it dulled the pain of the 16-hour days. They drank small beer, low alcohol with lunch and dinner. They gossiped viciously. They knew everything. They knew who was sleeping with whom. They knew which lady patted her hips. They knew which gentleman wore a corset. Yes, men wore them too. They read the family's letters. Not officially, of course, but if a letter was left open on a desk, well, a swift glance never hurt anyone. They pieced together the family dramas like detectives. I see the young master is writing to that actress again. The one from the Gaiety Theater. The very same. And he's asked the master for an advance on his allowance. Oh, they'll be shouting in the library tonight. They also read penny dreadfuls. These were cheap, sensational novels that cost a penny. They were full of murder, ghosts, vampires, and highwaymen. The maids loved them. They would huddle around a candle, reading about Varney the vampire, or Sweeney Todd, scaring themselves silly in the already creepy basement. It was the Netflix true crime of 1888. But there was a darker side to the nightlife too. The lack of privacy meant that relationships between servants were complicated. As I mentioned, followers were forbidden. But human nature is human nature. There were furtive glances across the ironing board, notes passed in coal scuttles, quick meetings in the pantry when the butler was asleep. If they were caught, it was disaster. Instant dismissal. So romance had the thrill of high-stakes a stolen kiss behind the green baize door was the equivalent of a diamond heist. And sometimes the danger came from upstairs. The young gentlemen of the house often saw the maids as available. It's a trope in fiction, but it was a grim reality. A maid had very little power to say no to the master's son. If she complained, she'd be fired for leading him on. It was a trap. Many a maid ended up in trouble, pregnant and cast out, while the young gentleman went on his grand tour of Europe without a scratch on his reputation. But let's not dwell too deeply on the tragedy just yet. Let's look at the sleeping arrangements again. The footmen often slept in the basement, sometimes in folding beds in the pantry to guard the silver. They were essentially guard dogs. The hall boy, the lowest male servant, basically a child who polished boots, often slept in a cupboard. A literal cupboard. Or under a table. He was the basement elf. As the clock strikes 2 a.m., the house finally goes quiet. The fires are banked. The gas is turned down to a blue flicker. The master and mistress are asleep in their four-poster beds. The servants are curled up in their attics and basements. But even in sleep, they are listening. They are tuned to the frequency of the bells. If a bell rings at 3 a.m., the lady's maid has to wake up instantly. Maybe the mistress has a headache. Maybe she wants a glass of water. The servant's body doesn't really belong to them. It's on loan. There's a strange intimacy to the silence of the house at night. You can hear the settling of the floorboards, the distant rattle of a carriage on the cobblestones outside. In 1888, the silence was heavy. There was no hum of refrigerators, no distant traffic drone like today. Just the wind in the chimney and the scratching of mice in the wainscot. And speaking of mice, pest control was another unpaid duty. The scullery maid was often the one setting the traps, or the cat. Every house had a cat, not as a pet, but as an employee. The cat was the only one who didn't have to answer bells, and frankly, the servants probably envied it. So, Monday is over, Tuesday is coming, and Tuesday means ironing. If you thought washing was bad, wait until you hear about the sad irons. They were called that for a reason. Let's drift towards the laundry room again, in our minds, as the sun begins to think about rising over the smoky chimneypots of London. Now we are going to drift back into the misty, slightly confusing world of the Middle Ages. We usually spend a lot of time here, talking about specific kings who made bad choices because their parents were first cousins, and we will definitely get back to them soon. But tonight, I wanted to broaden the scope a little bit. I want to look at the culture as a whole, because sometimes it wasn't just one specific ruler making bad decisions. Sometimes entire societies decided to do things that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. So, go ahead and dim the lights down low. Pull the comforter up to your chin. Get that pillow exactly how you like it. Let your mind just sort of float away from the modern world. Let's drift back to a time when people didn't have the internet to tell them things were dangerous, so they just sort of guessed, and usually guessed wrong. We are going to look at some medieval trends that were, quite frankly, completely stupid. Trends that people followed because everyone else was doing it, even though it was actively harmful to their health. It's a relaxing journey into historical incompetence. Let's begin with fashion, because nothing says I have too much time on my hands and not enough actual problems. Quite like fashion trends that physically incapacitate you. We are going to float back to the 14th century. It was a busy time. You had the 100 Years' War starting up. You had the Black Death making its rounds, which we will avoid talking about too much because that's not very sleepy. But right in the middle of all this chaos, the nobility of Europe decided the most important issue of the day was footwear. Specifically, they became obsessed with a shoe called the Krakow, or sometimes the Poulain. These were named after Krakow, in Poland, because apparently that's where this particular bad idea originated. Now, these weren't just regular shoes. That would be too easy. These were shoes with incredibly long, pointed toes. It started out reasonably enough. Maybe an inch or two of extra point past the toe, just enough to trip slightly on cobblestones. But fashion is rarely reasonable for long. Soon, it became a competition, because, of course it did. The length of your shoe point became a status symbol. The longer the point, the more important you were. It was a very literal, very silly measuring contest. If you were a commoner, you were legally restricted to a point of about 6 inches, which is still too much point, if you ask me. But if you were a knight, you could go up to a foot over your actual toe. And if you were a high-ranking noble, or perhaps a prince who didn't have enough administrative work to do, your shoe points could extend 2 feet or more beyond your foot. Just imagine walking around like that. You would have 2 feet of floppy leather extending from each foot. You couldn't walk upstairs properly. You certainly couldn't run. You basically had to develop a weird, high-stepping gait just to move from the dining hall to the privy without planting your face in the rushes on the floor. It got so ridiculous that they had 2 engineer solutions for the problem they had created. The points got so long and floppy that they wouldn't stay straight. They would just curl up or get caught under the other foot. So, they started stuffing the toes with moss or wool to keep them stiff. When that wasn't enough, they employed mechanics. Nobles started using little gold or silver chains. They would attach one end of the chain to the tip of the shoe point and the other end to a garter just below their knee. Just picture that. A grown man, perhaps a duke, walking around with his shoes chained to his shins. It must have clinked terribly every time he took a step. But he felt very cool, and that's what matters. The church, naturally, hated these shoes. They called them Satan's claws, because the medieval church had a flair for the dramatic and blamed Satan for pretty much anything they found annoying. They claimed the long toes prevented men from kneeling properly in prayer, which was probably true. It's hard to be humble when your footwear is taking up 4 feet of floor space. Clergy preached sermons against the shoes. They said wearing them was a sign of worldly vanity that would lead straight to damnation. And for once, the clergy were sort of onto something, though perhaps not in the spiritual sense, because these shoes did actually get people killed. Let's float over to the year 1396. There was a massive crusade organized against the Ottoman Empire. The flower of French nobility showed up. These were the richest, most arrogant young knights in Europe, and of course they brought their best clothes to the war zone, because if you're going to fight a crusade, you want to look fabulous doing it. This crusade culminated in the Battle of Nicopolis in modern-day Bulgaria. The French knights were very confident. They were also very undisciplined. They decided to charge the Ottoman lines head-on, because strategy was apparently for people who didn't have expensive armor. They charged in, and things immediately went wrong. They got bogged down. They encountered fortified stakes in the ground. They were surrounded. It became clear, very quickly, that they needed to retreat. They needed to turn around and run away to fight another day. But there was a problem. A very fashionable problem. Many of these high-ranking French knights were wearing they had shown up to a battlefield wearing shoes with 20-inch points chained to their knees. When they tried to dismount from their horses, the long toes got caught in the stirrups. When they tried to run on the uneven, muddy ground, the points stabbed into the earth, tripping them over. You cannot sprint for your life when your feet are effectively 3 feet long. The Ottoman forces just sort of walked up to them while they were stumbling around, trying to untangle their chained shoes from the underbrush. It wasn't a glorious last stand. It was a bunch of very rich men tripping over their own vanity. The chroniclers of the time specifically mentioned that the knights had to desperately cut off the long points of their shoes with their swords, just so they could try to walk away. But for many, it was too late. They died because they prioritized pointy footwear over tactical mobility, which is a very specific, very embarrassing way to go. Let's leave the battlefields of Bulgaria behind. Let's drift back to the drafty, castles and manor houses, and look at something a bit more domestic. Let's talk about beauty standards. We all know beauty standards can be difficult to live up to, but in the Middle Ages and creeping into the Renaissance, they were actively toxic. I'm talking about makeup. The ideal look for a highborn woman, and often highborn men too, was to be incredibly pale. You wanted to look as if you had never seen the sun, and possibly hadn't eaten a solid meal in 3 weeks. A nice, sickly pallor was all the rage. It showed you didn't have to work outside like a commoner. Asterisk, if you weren't naturally pale, you had to help nature along, and the best way to achieve that ghostly white look was with a foundation made of white lead. Asterisk, it was known as Venetian cerut. It was a mixture of white lead pigment and vinegar. It created this thick, opaque white paste that you could plaster all over your face, neck, and chest. It covered up blemishes, smallpox, scars, and any hint of a healthy complexion. Asterisk, it looked great by the standards of the time. It gave you that smooth, mask-like appearance that everyone coveted. The problem, which I'm sure you've already spotted, is that it was made of lead, and lead is a neurotoxin. Asterisk, but they didn't really understand that back then. Or if they did, they didn't care enough to stop. Beauty is pain, after all. Asterisk, so these noble women would wake up in the morning and have their servants paint their faces with poison. And the thing about this lead makeup was that you weren't supposed to wash it off every day. Water was considered suspicious, which we'll get to later. Washing your face too often was thought to be bad for the skin. Asterisk, so a woman might apply a layer of this lead paste on Monday. On Tuesday, instead of washing it off, she would just apply another layer on top to freshen it up. By Friday, she might have half an inch of toxic sludge caked onto her face. The lead would slowly seep through the pores and into the bloodstream. Asterisk, the symptoms of lead poisoning are slow and awful. It starts with headaches, maybe some nausea, general fatigue, things that are easily explained away in a medieval castle where it's always damp and drafty. But over time, it got worse. It would cause severe abdominal pain. It would make your teeth turn gray and eventually fall out, which is ironic because the whole point was to look beautiful. It caused hair loss. It caused mental instability, mood swings, and memory loss. We often read about queens and noble women in history described as hysterical or prone to sudden fits of rage as they got older. And you have to wonder how much of that was just their personalities, and how much of it was the fact that they had been marinating their brains in lead for 20 years. The saddest part was that the lead makeup actually damaged the skin underneath. It would cause terrible acne, scarring, and discoloration. So, when a woman finally did wash the makeup off, her skin looked worse than before, which meant she felt she had to apply even thicker layers of the lead paint to cover up the damage the lead paint was causing. It was a vicious, toxic cycle. There are many recorded cases of noble women dying young after years of using these cosmetics. The most famous, though a bit later than the medieval period, was Queen Elizabeth I, who famously plastered her face in white lead to cover smallpox scars. By the end of her life, she was said to be losing her hair and teeth and suffering from severe cognitive decline. It was a slow, creeping kind of death, brought on by the simple desire to look fashionable. But it wasn't just what they put on their bodies that was a problem. It was also what they refused to put on their bodies, namely, water. Let's float over to the general concept of hygiene, or the lack thereof. There is a popular myth that medieval people never bathed. That's not entirely true. In the early Middle Ages, public bathhouses were actually quite common in cities. a leftover tradition from the Roman Empire. People did like to be clean, generally speaking. But then, things changed. As we move into the later Middle Ages and the early modern period, a new trend emerged. A trend against bathing. This was largely driven by the medical community of the time, and when primata, medical community, I mean men in robes who read books written 1,000 years prior and based most of their diagnoses on astrology, these doctors came up with a theory that bathing was actually dangerous. They believed that hot water opened up the pores of the skin, and they thought that open pores allowed miasma's bad air-carrying diseases to enter the body. So, the logic was, if you take a bath, you are inviting the plague into your body. Therefore, the safest thing to do is to keep a nice, thick layer of dirt and grime clogging your pores at all times. It's basically a protective shield against disease. This trend really took hold among the upper classes. Commoners probably still rinsed off in rivers because they were covered in mud from working, but the nobility embraced the no-bathing lifestyle with enthusiasm. There are stories of kings and dukes who famously only took 2 or 3 baths in their entire lives, usually just before their coronation or perhaps their wedding. Queen Isabella of Castile, a very powerful monarch, famously boasted that she had only bathed twice in her life, when she was born. And on the day she married Ferdinand of Aragon, she seemed very proud of this fact. You have to feel a little bad for Ferdinand. Instead of bathing, they would change their linen undergarments. That was the definition of cleanliness. If you put on a clean shirt, you were clean. They would also use heavy perfumes, powders, and little bags of sweet-smelling herbs tucked into their clothes to mask the inevitable aroma of dozens of unwashed bodies packed into a poorly ventilated great hall. The consequence of this trend wasn't usually direct death, like the lead makeup. It was more that it created an environment where simple issues became lethal. Minor cuts and scrapes on the skin, which today would be nothing, would instantly become infected because the skin was covered in bacteria. Skin conditions were rampant. Lice and fleas were just a fact of life for everyone, from the lowest peasant to the king of France. And these parasites carried diseases like typhus. While they thought they were protecting themselves from miasmas by not bathing, they were actually creating a perfect breeding ground for real pathogens. It was a trend based on bad science that made everyone uncomfortable, itchy, and smell terrible, while also making them more vulnerable to actual infections. It was a lose-lose situation, all in the name of staying healthy. It just goes to show how sometimes the collective wisdom of an era can be completely, dangerously wrong. We're going to take a short pause here. Just keep your eyes closed. Breathe in slowly. And out. And out. When we come back, we're going to look at how even eating dinner could be a life-threatening activity in the Middle Ages. Welcome back. I hope you're still comfortable. Maybe you've shifted positions a little, tucked the blanket under your feet. Let's just drift right back to where we left off. We were about to sit down for dinner in a medieval great hall. Now, you might think eating is a relatively safe activity. You pick up a fork, well, actually, you wouldn't pick up a fork, because forks were considered effeminate and Italian for a very long time, and real men ate with their knives and fingers. But you would pick up some food, put it in your mouth, and chew. Simple. But in the Middle Ages, nothing was simple, especially if you were rich. The nobility had turned dining into a competitive sport called the feast, and the goal of the feast wasn't just to feed people. It was to impress them with how much money you could waste. One of the big trends in medieval dining was something called the subtlety. This was basically a special effect made out of food. It was brought out between courses to entertain the guests. We aren't talking about a simple fruit tart here. We are talking about sculptures made of sugar, marzipan, and jelly that looked like castles, or ships, or famous battles, or saints being martyred. Chefs would spend days constructing these things, and because presentation was everything, they wanted these sculptures to be colorful. They wanted the lion to look like a real golden lion. They wanted the Green Knight to be a vibrant, grassy green. But they didn't have red dye number 40. They didn't have spirulina extract. So, what did they use to color the food? Paint. Actual, literal paint. To get a nice bright red, they would use cinnabar, which is mercury sulfide. To get a brilliant yellow or gold, they might use orpiment, which is arsenic sulfide. For white, we are back to our old friend, white lead. So the servants would march out this magnificent sugar castle, glittering in the candlelight, covered in toxic heavy metals, and the guests would applaud. And then, because it was made of sugar, they would eat it. It wasn't just the sculptures. Sometimes they would take a whole roasted peacock, dress it back up in its own feather switch, were full of dust and lice, and then gild the beak with gold leaf attached with weird glues. There are accounts of feasts where guests would fall ill almost immediately, and the chroniclers would write it off as a surfeit of lampreys or bad humors. But, in reality, half the royal court was probably suffering from acute arsenic poisoning because they ate the yellow marzipan tower. It was a trend where looking rich was far more important than surviving the meal. But let's say you survived the poison sugar castle. Let's say you were a king or a very high-ranking duke, and you were feeling a bit under the weather. Maybe you had that sluggish feeling that comes from low-level lead poisoning. You needed a doctor. This brings us to one of the most dangerously stupid trends of the medieval and Renaissance periods, the consumption of precious materials. The logic went like this. Gold is a perfect metal. It never rusts. It never tarnishes. It is beautiful and eternal. Therefore, if I put gold inside my body will become perfect, beautiful, and eternal. It's the kind of logic a 5-year-old would use. But in the 15th century, it was cutting-edge medical science. It was colorum potabile, or potable gold. Rich people would pay absolute fortunes for elixirs that claimed to contain liquid gold. Now, gold is a metal. It doesn't really want to be a liquid unless it's incredibly hot, which you don't want to drink. So, alchemists would dissolve gold filings in various acids, or mix gold dust into wine or oil. If you were lucky, the gold just passed right through you. It was an expensive way to make your chamber pots sparkle, but harmless. But usually, you weren't lucky. To dissolve the gold, alchemists often used aqua regia, a mix of nitric and hydrochloric acid, or they used mercury to create an amalgam. So, you weren't just drinking gold. You were drinking acid and mercury cocktails. There is a famous story about Diane de Poitiers. She wasn't a queen, but she was the mistress of King Henry II of France, and she was arguably more powerful than the actual queen. She was famous for her unaging beauty. She looked incredibly young, well into her 60s. Everyone wanted to know her secret. Her secret was that she drank a daily tonic of gold chloride mixed with diethyl ether. She was literally preserving herself like a pickle. When scientists analyzed her remains, centuries later, they found massive levels of gold in her hair and bones. The gold was slowly killing her. It made her bones brittle and her immune system collapse. She died slowly, likely in agony, because she believed that drinking metal was the key to eternal youth. It was the ultimate wellness trend gone wrong. And it wasn't just gold. They did this with gemstones, too. Crushed emeralds were thought to cure stomach problems. Crushed pearls were for melancholy Pope Clement VII in the 1530s. Got sick. His doctors, wanting to give him the very best care, fed him spoonfuls of pulverized diamonds and other precious stones. The idea was that the purity of the stones would pull the sickness out. Instead, feeding a sick old man a bowl of sharp, glassy grit did exactly what you would expect it to do. It shredded his digestive tract. The cure killed him much faster than the disease ever would have, but at least he died expensively. That was the important thing. Let's float away from the dinner table and the doctor's office. Let's look at a trend that was less about the body and more about the soul. But, ironically, it destroyed the body anyway. I'm talking about competitive piety. In the Middle Ages, religion wasn't just a belief system, it was a lifestyle. And for the nobility, it was another thing to be better at than everyone else. It became trendy for royals to show how humble and holy they were by treating their own bodies terribly. This brings us to the hair shirt, or vesilithe. This was a garment made of coarse animal, usually goat or camel, that was woven into a rough, scratchy shirt. You would wear it directly against your skin, underneath your fine silk robes. The idea was that the constant itching and scratching would remind you of the suffering of Christ. It was a secret penance. But some people took this trend way too far. There were royals who would wear these hair shirts for weeks or months without taking them off. They wouldn't wash them. They wouldn't wash themselves. The coarse hair would rub the skin raw. It would create open sores. And because the shirt was never washed, it became a breeding ground for bacteria. The sores would get infected. The fabric would fuse into the scabs. There are records of saints and holy kings, like Louis IX of France, who practiced this kind of extreme mortification. While Louis survived it for a while, others weren't so lucky. Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was famously murdered in his cathedral. But when they stripped his body to prepare it for burial, they found he was wearing a hair shirt that was absolutely teeming with lice and infection. The chroniclers described it with a mix of horror and admiration. They thought it was a sign of his extreme holiness. Modern doctors would look at it and say, that man was about 2 days away from dying of sepsis anyway. This trend of holy hygiene neglect was shockingly common. There was a belief that the smell of a dirty, unsuffering saint was actually the odor of sanctity. If you smelled bad because you were neglecting your body for God, that was a good smell. So, you had entire monasteries and convents where people were dying of simple skin infections and preventable diseases, because the trend of the day said that washing or tending to your wounds was a sign of vanity. It was a culture that equated physical health with spiritual weakness. Let's drift over to another area of life where trends got people killed. The legal system, specifically the trend of letting God decide. We are going to talk about trial by ordeal. This was a legal trend that lasted for centuries. It was used when a judge couldn't decide if someone was guilty or innocent based on evidence. Maybe there were no witnesses. Maybe it was just one person's word against another's. Instead of investigating, they would just invoke a miracle. One popular version was the trial by hot iron. The accused person had to carry a piece of red-hot iron for a certain distance, usually 9 feet. Then, their hand was bandaged up. 3 days later, they would unwrap the bandage. If the wound was healing cleanly, it meant God had protected them, and they were innocent. If the wound was festering or infected, it meant they were guilty. Think about what we just discussed regarding hygiene. Think about the lack of hand washing. Think about the general state of medical knowledge. If you were a blacksmith with tough, calloused hands, you might be fine. If you were a noble with soft hands who had just rubbed lead makeup on your face, you were in trouble. Whether you were found guilty or innocent had almost nothing to do with whether you committed the crime. It depended entirely on your immune system and how clean the bandage was. If your wound got infected, let's be honest, it probably would. You were declared guilty, and then you were usually executed. So the infection might not kill you, but the hangman certainly would. Another variation was the trial by water. This was often used for witch trials later on, but it had medieval roots. The accused was tied up and thrown into a pond or river that had been blessed by a priest. The logic was that water is a pure element. If the person sank, the water was accepting them, so they were innocent. If they floated, the water was rejecting them, so they were guilty. So, your options were a sink to the bottom of a river while tied up, which carries a significant risk of drowning. If they fished you out in time, congratulations, you're innocent. Or B, float, be declared guilty, and then be burned or hanged. It was a legal trend where the survival rate was incredibly low, regardless of your actual innocence. It was a system designed to kill you one way or another. Eventually, the Pope actually had to step in. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council basically said, "Okay, stop doing this. Priests aren't allowed to bless the water or the iron anymore." The Church realized that asking for a miracle every Tuesday was probably pushing their luck. But the fact that it went on for so long just shows how powerful a trend can be. People really believed that burning their hands was a valid way to find the truth. Let's shift gears now. Let's move away from the heavy stuff like law and religion and float back to something a bit more frivolous. Let's talk about parties. Specifically, a very dangerous kind of party trend called the masquerade of the wild men. The French court in the late 14th century was a weird place. We talked earlier about the Krakow shoes at the Battle of Nika. Well, the king at the time was Charles VI. He was known as Charles the Mad because he had frequent bouts of insanity where he forgot who he was or thought he was made of glass. But in between his episodes, the court tried to cheer him up with parties. In 1393, they decided to throw a masquerade ball to celebrate a wedding. The trend for this party was to dress up as wild men, mythical forest creatures. The king and 5 of his noble friends decided to perform a dance. To make their costumes, they took linen bodysuits and covered them in pitch. Pitch is basically tree resin or tar. It's incredibly sticky and incredibly flammable. Then they stuck frayed hemp and flax all over the pitch to look like hair. So you have 6 men, including the King of France, covered in tar and dry grass. They looked like walking candle wicks. Asterisk, they were sewn into these costumes. They couldn't get out of them quickly. Asterisk, they came into the darkened hall to perform their wild dance. The rule was no torches allowed near the dancers. That was a sensible rule. Asterisk, but the king's brother, the Duke of Orleans, arrived late. A was drunk, and he wanted to see who was under the masks. So he grabbed a torch and held it right up to one of the dancers' faces. Asterisk, of course. The spark jumped. The dancer went up in flames instantly, because they were chained together for the dance, and because the costumes were made of tar and dry grass, the fire spread to the others in seconds. Asterisk, it was a scene of absolute horror. The Bal des Ardents. They called it the Ball of the Burning Men. Asterisk, 4 of the dancers burned to death in front of the entire court. One saved himself by jumping into a vat of wine and water used to rinse cups. The king was only saved because his young aunt, the Duchess of Berry, had the presence of mind to throw her heavy velvet skirt over him and smother the flames. Asterisk, it was a tragedy caused entirely by a stupid party trend. They wanted to look cool and savage. They wanted to do something edgy. And because they didn't respect basic fire safety and because the king's brother was a idiot, 4 noblemen died, screaming in the middle of a ballroom. Asterisk, after that, the wild man costume trend died out pretty quickly. But it's a perfect example of how the boredom of the nobility, combined with a total lack of common sense, could lead to disaster. Let's take a moment. Just breathe. It's a lot of chaos to absorb. But you're safe here. You're not covered in tar. You're not wearing shoes that are 3 feet long. You're just lying there, letting these stories float by. We're going to drift forward a little bit now. We're going to leave the medieval period behind and dip our toes into the early Renaissance. Because if you thought medieval trends were stupid, just wait until you see what they did when they discovered science. We'll talk about how they thought tobacco was a vitamin and how they used radioactive materials for toothpaste. But first, let's talk about wigs. Welcome back. We left off with a teaser about wigs, didn't we? Let's settle back into the cushions and pick up that thread. You might think wigs are just a fashion statement, and in the 18th century, with those massive white powdered towers, they certainly were. But the origin of the wig trend in the late medieval and early Renaissance periods was a bit darker. It wasn't about style, it was about covering up a very embarrassing medical problem. It started with the return of Columbus and his crew from the New World. Along with potatoes and tomatoes, they allegedly brought back something less delightful. The Great Pox, or as we know it, syphilis. It swept through Europe like wildfire, and one of the most visible symptoms was patchy hair loss. Suddenly, having a full head of hair was the ultimate status symbol, because it meant you didn't have the pox. If you started going bald in your 20s, everyone knew exactly what you had been up to. So, the wig was born out of shame. But because this is history, and humans are ridiculous, they couldn't just wear a discreet hairpiece. They had to make it a trend. King Louis XIV of France started losing his hair at 17. He hired 48 wigs. Suddenly, if you wanted to be anyone at court, you needed a massive, flowing wig. It became a symbol of power. The bigger the wig, the more power you had. But these wigs were disgusting. They were made of horsehair, goat hair, or human hair bought from peasants. They were heavy, very hot, and they were impossible to clean. To make them look white and fresh, they would powder them with flour or starch. And what loves flour? Mites and lice and rats. There are stories of wig-wearing nobles sitting at dinner, and a mouse would just scurry out of their hair. It became a trend to have a scratching stick, a long, thin rod made of ivory or gold that you could slide up under your wig to scratch the lice bites without messing up the curls. So you had the entire ruling class of Europe walking around with vermin-infested carpets on their heads, all because they were trying to hide the fact that they were sick. And speaking of being sick, let's look at how they tried to cure this great pox. Because the cure was often much worse than the disease. The primary treatment for syphilis for about 400 years was mercury. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. That was the saying. They knew mercury was toxic. They knew it made your teeth fall out and your gums bleed. They knew it made you drool uncontrollably soon times pints of saliva a day. But they thought that the drooling was the sickness leaving the body. One popular trend was the fumigation box. This was basically a personal sauna from hell. The patient would be placed inside a wooden box or a tent with only their head sticking out. Underneath, the doctor would place a bowl of mercury over a fire. The mercury would vaporize, filling the box. The patient would sit there, naked, literally cooking in toxic metal fumes for hours. The idea was to sweat out the disease. The reality was that they were absorbing massive amounts of neurotoxin directly through their skin and lungs. Many patients died right there in the box, from heart failure or dehydration. Others went mad from the mercury poisoning. But because the sores sometimes cleared up temporarily, mostly because the mercury was killing everything, including the bacteria, doctors kept prescribing it. It was a medical trend that persisted for centuries, torturing and killing thousands of people who might have lived much longer if they had just done nothing. But mercury wasn't the only miracle cure that got people killed. Let's float over to the most popular medical trend of the entire medieval era. The one thing every doctor agreed on. Bloodletting. The theory was based on the 4 humors. Doctors believed the human body was filled with 4 liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it meant these liquids were out of balance, and usually the diagnosis was that you had too much blood. It didn't matter what was actually wrong with you. Fever, too much blood. Headache, too much blood. Broken leg, probably too much blood. Better drain some, just to be safe. It was TWE, the 40th medieval medicine. They would use leeches, or they would just open a vein with a lancet, and they weren't taking a small sample like a modern nurse. They were taking pints. If a patient fainted, the doctor often took that as a good sign. It meant the fever had broken. In reality, the patient had just gone into hypovolemic shock. This trend was particularly deadly for royals because they had too many doctors. When a king got sick, every doctor in the room wanted to help, so one doctor would bleed him from the right arm. Then another doctor, wanting to be useful, would bleed him from the left foot. Then a third would put leeches on his neck. King Charles II of England, moving slightly past the medieval period, but the mindset was the same, suffered a stroke. His doctors, in their panic to save him, bled him of about 24 ounces of blood. Then they gave him an enema. Then they shaved his head and blistered his skin with hot irons. Then they bled him again. Unsurprisingly, he died. He likely died of the cure rather than the stroke. But bloodletting was just the standard procedure. If you really wanted to get into the weird, dangerous trends, you have to look at surgery. Specifically, brain surgery. Let's talk about trepanation. This is actually one of the oldest surgical procedures in history, but it saw a big revival in the Middle Ages. The idea was simple. If someone is acting weird, maybe they have epilepsy, or migraines, or they're just melancholy. it's because there is something trapped in their skull. Maybe a demon, maybe bad air. The solution: drill a hole in the head to let it out. Now, remember, there was no anesthesia. There was no antiseptic. There was just a man with a hand drill and some assistants to hold you down. They would cut open the scalp and bore a hole through the bone, exposing the dura mater of the brain. The belief was that once the air hit the brain, the fumes would escape. Amazingly, some people actually survived this. We have found medieval skulls with healed trepanation holes. But many, many more did not. They died of infection, or because the surgeon drilled too deep and hit the brain itself. It became a trend for treating madness. If a noble was acting erratic, the family might pay a lot of money to have a hole drilled in his head. It was seen as a proactive high-tech solution. Oh, Earl Godwin is feeling much better now that he has that draft in his skull. Let's drift away from the gruesome surgery table. Let's look at something softer, something prettier. Let's talk about eyes. In Italy, during the Renaissance, a new beauty trend emerged. Large, dilated pupils were considered incredibly attractive. It gave a woman a dreamy, soft, aroused look. But you can't just will your pupils to dilate. You need chemistry. So, women started using eye drops made from the plant Atropa. The name literally means beautiful lady. But in English, we know it as deadly. It worked. It paralyzed the muscles in the iris, forcing the pupil to stay wide open. The women looked stunning by the standards of the day. The side effects, however, were less stunning. The drops caused blurry vision. Then, sensitivity to light. If you used them too much, you would get heart palpitations, hallucinations. Eventually, prolonged use could lead to permanent blindness. So you had an entire generation of fashionable Italian women stumbling around, half-blind, hearts racing, seeing things that weren't there, all because a magazine or the 16th century equivalent of one said that big pupils were in this season. It's another classic example of beauty as pain, except in this case, beauty was also permanent disability. Let's float down from the lady's eyes to the nursery, because even babies weren't safe from stupid medieval trends. Let's talk about swaddling. Now, swaddling is still a thing today. We wrap babies in blankets to make them feel secure. That's fine. But in the Middle Ages, they took it to an extreme level. They believed that babies were essentially soft clay. If you didn't mold them, they would grow up crooked. They thought that if a baby was left free to move its limbs, it would crawl on all fours like an animal and never learn to walk upright. So, they didn't just wrap the baby in a blanket. They effectively mummified it. They would take long strips of linen and bind the baby's legs straight together, then bind the arms to the sides. They would wrap it so tight that the baby couldn't move a single muscle. Then, they would often leave the baby like that for hours, or even a full day. They would hang the swaddled baby on a hook on the wall like a coat to keep it out of the way of rats and draft. This caused huge problems. Because the babies couldn't move, their muscles didn't develop properly. They got no exercise. And because they were often kept inside in dark huts and covered in layers of cloth, they got no sunlight. No sunlight means no vitamin D. No vitamin D means rickets. Rickets is a disease that makes bones soft and weak. It causes bowed legs, curved spines, and stunted growth. So, the very practice that was supposed to ensure the baby grew up straight and tall, binding them tight, was actually causing them to grow up with deformed skeletons. It was a tragic irony. They were literally squeezing the health out of their children because that's how it's always been done. And since we are talking about children, we should mention the trend of the changeling. This wasn't a medical trend, but a superstitious one that had lethal consequences. If a child was born with a disability, or if they were just a bit quiet, or maybe too loud, or if they had a birthmark, people might decide that this wasn't their real child. They would decide that the fairies had stolen their human baby and left a changeling in its place. To trend for curing a changeling or getting the fairies to take it back was horrific. It involved placing the child on a hot shovel over a fire, or leaving them outside in the woods overnight, or dipping them in freezing rivers. The logic was, if I hurt this fake baby, the the fairies will feel bad and bring my real baby back. In reality, it just meant that parents were encouraged by their community to abuse or kill their own vulnerable children. It was a trend of explaining away genetic disorders with folklore, and it led to untold suffering for the most innocent members of society. It's heavy stuff, I know. But the past was a heavy place. Let's take a deep breath. Let's clear the air of mercury fumes and superstition. We've covered fashion, medicine, law, and childcare. But we haven't really touched on one of the biggest killers of the Middle Ages, the architecture itself. You see, castles look romantic, but living in them was a health hazard. And I'm not just talking about the drafts, I'm talking about the floors. When we come back for the next part, we are going to look at the rushes. We are going to look at what was hiding under the feet of the nobility. And then, we are finally going to meet a specific family. A family that took the trend of keeping it in the family to a level that reshaped the chin of Europe. Just relax. Let the darkness of the room wrap around you like a warm, non-constricting blanket. No swaddling here. Just comfort. Welcome back. I hope you're still with me. Drifting along on this tide of historical mishaps, we left off at the threshold of the medieval castle. We were about to step inside. Now, usually, when we picture a castle, we think of stone floors, cold, hard, maybe echoing with the footsteps of a guard. But in reality, walking on cold stone all day is uncomfortable. It's bad for the knees. It's chilly in the winter. So, medieval people came up with a solution, a trend in interior design that lasted for centuries. They covered the floors in rushes. Rushes are basically dried plants, reeds, straw, sweet-smelling herbs, like lavender or meadowsweet. They would scatter layers of this plant, matter all over the floor of the great hall and the private chambers. It was meant to be insulation, a soft, organic carpet. It sounds lovely, doesn't it? Walking on a bed of dried flowers. The problem, as with most things in this era, was maintenance, or rather, the lack of it. You see, they didn't really change the rushes, they just added to them. When the top layer got a bit trampled or dirty, they would just sprinkle a fresh layer of straw on top. It was the out-of-sight, out-of-mind approach to housekeeping. The Dutch philosopher Erasmus visited England in the 16th century, so we are even past the medieval period here. But the habit stuck and he was horrified. He wrote a letter describing the floors of English noble houses. He said that the bottom layer of rushes often remained undisturbed for 20 years. 22 years. Just think about that. Think about what falls on a floor in 20 years. Erasmus listed the contents of this 20-year-old carpet. He mentioned sputum, vomit, the leakage of dogs and men, ale, scraps of fish, and other abominations not to be mentioned. It was a composting ecosystem right inside the living room. If you dropped a chicken bone, you just kicked it into the rushes. If the dog had an accident, you just covered it with fresh straw. If you spilled your beer, the floor absorbed it. This created a warm, damp, fermenting layer of filth at the bottom. It was the perfect incubator for bacteria. It was a 5-star hotel for fleas, lice, and rats. So, while the king sat on his throne, looking very majestic, the air he was breathing was filled with the spores of decaying organic matter and the fleas that carried the Black Death. They were living happily in the floorboards, just waiting for an ankle to bite. This trend of layered flooring likely contributed to the rapid spread of plagues in noble households. They were literally living on top of a biohazard. But because it felt soft and smelled faintly of dried lavender, at least on the surface, they kept doing it. Let's float away from the floor and look at another aspect of castle life. Let's look at the family. We touched on this earlier, but the biggest trend among European royalty wasn't a shoe or a hat. It was a marriage strategy. The goal was simple. Keep the land in the family. Don't let outsiders inherit your titles. How do you do that? You marry your cousin, or your niece, or your uncle. This trend reached its absolute, tragic peak with the House of Habsburg. The Habsburgs were the most powerful family in Europe. They ruled Spain, Austria, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and huge chunks of the New World. They were obsessed with purity of blood, but genetics doesn't care about your titles. Genetics cares about diversity, and the Habsburgs had none. Over generations, this trend of uncle-niece marriages created a genetic bottleneck that manifested physically. We call it the Habsburg jaw. It's a condition called mandibular prognathism. The lower jaw grows faster than the upper jaw. It juts out. The chin becomes massive and pointed. The lower teeth extend past the upper teeth, making it impossible to close the mouth properly. You can see it in their portraits. King Philip IV of Spain looks like he's trying to swallow his own face. But the tragic finale of this trend was King Charles II of Spain. He is the ultimate example of why you should broaden your dating pool. Charles was born in 1661. His family tree wasn't a tree, it was a wreath. His mother was his father's niece. His grandmother was also his aunt. All four of his great-grandparents were descendants of the same two people. Charles was a disaster from the moment he was born. He was described as El Hechizado, the bewitched, because people thought his condition was a curse rather than simple biology. He didn't learn to speak until he was 4. He couldn't walk until he was 8. His jaw was so deformed that he couldn't chew his food. He had to swallow everything whole, which caused him terrible indigestion. His tongue was so large, he could barely be understood when he spoke. He was short, lame, epileptic, and senile before he turned 30. The court physicians tried to help him with the usual stupid trends we've discussed. They covered him in hot blankets. They fed him crushed pearls. They placed dead pigeons on his head to draw out the humors. Unsurprisingly, none of this fixed his chromosome. Charles died at 38. The autopsy report, which is likely exaggerated but still paints a vivid picture, stated that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were rotten and gangrenous, and he had a single testicle, black-ass caul. The irony is that the Habsburgs did all this inbreeding to preserve their dynasty. But because Charles was infertile, the line ended with him anyway. The very trend they used to keep power is exactly what destroyed them. It's a slow, sad story of a family loving itself to death. But let's not just focus on the living royals, because in the Middle Ages, even being dead didn't save you from stupid trends. Let's talk about the Cadaver Synod. This happened in the year 897. It's a bit earlier than the High Middle Ages, but it sets the tone perfectly. Pope Formosus died. It was buried. Everyone moved on. But his successor, Pope Stephen VI, had a grudge. A deep political grudge. He decided that Formosus had obtained the papacy illegally. Most people would just badmouth the guy, but Pope Stephen decided to follow a new legal trend. Putting the corpse on trial, he ordered Formosus's body to be dug up. It had been in the ground for about 7 months. They dressed the rotting corpse in full papal vestments. They propped it up on a throne in the courtroom. They even appointed a deacon to stand next to the corpse and answer for him, because Formosus was notably silent during the proceedings. Pope Stephen screamed at the corpse. He accused it of perjury and ambition. The deacon, presumably terrified and holding his breath, would lean in and whisper, "I am guilty," on behalf of the dead man. The verdict, shocking absolutely no one, was guilty. As bonus meant they cut off the 3 fingers of Formosus's right hand, the fingers used for blessings. They stripped him of his robes, and then they threw the body into the river Tiber. This trend of post-mortem vengeance backfired immediately. The people of Rome were horrified. A rumor started that Formosus's body had washed up on the riverbank and started performing miracles. The public rioted. Pope Stephen was thrown in prison and strangled shortly after. It just goes to show that sometimes the smartest move is to just let the dead stay buried. Speaking of burials, let's look at another royal funeral disaster, because sometimes the trend wasn't about vengeance, but about procrastination. Let's talk about William the Conqueror, the man who conquered England in 1066. A very serious, scary man. He died in 1087 in France. The problem was, William had gotten very large in his old age. He was a big man. When he died, his servants immediately looted his room. They stole his clothes, his furniture, even the bed linen, leaving his naked body on the floor, which is just rude. Eventually, some knights arranged for a funeral. They had a stone sarcophagus prepared inside the church. But there was a mix-up. The stone coffin was too small. The funeral was packed. Bishops, abbots, nobles. Everyone was there to pay respects. They lowered the king's body into the hole. It got stuck. The midsection was just too wide. But the gravediggers didn't want to give up. They decided to push. They thought if they just applied enough pressure, he would fit. Now, the body had been lying in the heat for weeks while they argued about the funeral. Decomposition produces gas. The body was essentially a pressurized balloon. When they pushed down on his stomach to wedge him into the stone, the pressure became too much. The king exploded. I won't go into graphic detail, but the chroniclers say the smell was so instant and so overpowering that people ran out of the church. The priests had to rush through the rest of the service while holding their noses, surrounded by a cloud of royal miasma. It happened again later with Henry VIII. His coffin actually cracked open in the middle of the night due to gas pressure, and dogs were found in the morning licking up what had leaked out. The trend here was a refusal to understand biology. They wanted the pomp and circumstance of a long, delayed funeral, but they didn't have the embalming technology to support it. They prioritized the show over the sanitation, and the result was messy. Let's shift gears again. Let's move from the gross to the bizarre. Let's look at a trend that affected entire towns. We are going to talk about the dancing plague. This sounds like a metaphor, but it wasn't. It was a real, documented phenomenon. The most famous one happened in Strasbourg in 1518. It started with one woman, Frau Trapp. She walked out into the street and started dancing. No music, just silent, fervent dancing. She didn't stop. She danced for days. Her feet were bleeding. She was exhausted. But she couldn't stop. Then, others joined in. Within a week, there were 30 people dancing. Within a month, there were 400. These people weren't having fun. They were screaming in pain. They were begging for it to stop, but their legs just kept moving. They were dancing themselves to death. People actually died of heart attacks, strokes, and exhaustion. They would dance until they collapsed, and if they could stand up again, they would start dancing again. Now, here is the stupid trend part. The city council didn't know what to do. They consulted the doctors. The doctors said it was hot blood. The prescription, more dancing. The authorities decided the only way to cure the dancers was to let them get it out of their systems. So they cleared a market square. They built a wooden stage, and this is the best part, they hired musicians. They hired professional pipers and drummers to play music for the people who were already dying of dancing. Of course, the music just made it worse. It encouraged more people to join in. It created a feedback loop of mass hysteria. Eventually, they realized this was a bad idea. They took the dancers to a shrine of Saint Vitus and forced them to wear red shoes or cut the red shoes off. Accounts vary and pray. Eventually, the plague subsided. Historians still argue about what caused it. Some say it was ergot poisoning a mold on rye bread that causes hallucinations and spasms similar to LSD. Others say it was a stress-induced mass psychogenic illness. Basically, life was so hard, so miserable, and the fear of God was so intense that people's brains just broke. They entered a trance state as a way to escape reality. It was a trend of collective madness. A social contagion. It shows how fragile the human mind really is when it's under pressure. Let's float back to the individual level for a moment. Let's talk about a trend in romance that was actually just stalking. We are going to look at courtly love. In literature, courtly love is beautiful. A knight devotes himself to a lady. He wears her favor. He writes her poems. He pines for her from afar. In reality, it was a trend that encouraged men to obsess over women who were usually married to someone else, and it often got people killed. The most famous example involves a troubadour named Guilhem de Ca. He fell in love with a noblewoman named Saramanda. She was married to a lord named Ramon. Guilhem wrote songs about her. Everyone knew who they were about. It was the medieval equivalent of posting vague, romantic status updates and tagging her. The husband, Ramon, was not amused. He confronted Guilhem. In a normal world, they might have had a duel, but Ramon followed a darker trend. He killed Gil. Then he cut out his heart. He took the heart to the kitchen. He had the cook roast it with spices. That night, at dinner, he served the heart to his wife. Saramonda, she ate it, thinking it was venison. After dinner, Ramon asked her if she enjoyed the meal. She said yes. He then told her what she had just eaten. He showed her Gilham's head just to prove it. Saramonda, in a moment of tragic defiance, said, "It was so good that I shall never eat nor drink anything else to take away the taste." Then she threw herself out the window and died. Now, is this story 100% historically accurate? Maybe. It appears in several but even if it is exaggerated, it reflects the extreme violence that lay underneath the polite trend of courtly love. It was a game of jealousy and possession masked as poetry. It was a trend that turned relationships into dangerous melodramas. And speaking of dangerous relationships, we have to talk about the trend of proxy marriages. Royals often married people they had never met. That's standard, but sometimes they couldn't even be bothered to show up for the wedding. So they would send a representative, a proxy. The proxy would stand at the altar. They would say the vows, and then, to make it legally binding, there was often a bedding ceremony. The proxy would have to get into bed with the bride, but to ensure nothing untoward happened, the groom would instruct the proxy to keep one leg bare and touch it against the bride's leg. It was a symbolic consummation. This usually went fine, but there were cases where the proxy got a little too comfortable, or the groom got jealous of the proxy. There are stories of knights who were sent to fetch a bride, fell in love with her on the long journey back, and ended up being executed for treason because they took the proxy role a little too seriously. Tristan and Isolde is the famous legend. But it happened in real life too. It was a system designed to create awkward, jealous triangles before the couple even met. We are going to take a pause here. Just let the image of the dancing plague fade. Let the stone coffins stop cracking. You are safe in your bed. The floor is clean. No rushes, no decomposing kings. When we come back, we are going to look at one of the most surprising killers of the medieval world. Books? Yes, reading could kill you, but not in the way you think. We will talk about poison paper, and then we will float into the strange world of sign-eaters. Just close your eyes. Relax your jadone. Be a Habsburg about it. Just let it hang loose.